So welcome to the 6th webinar of EPNoSL VIP, the virtual platform of the European Policy Network on School Leadership. My name is Nóra Révai. For those of you who participate for the first time in an EPNoSL event, a few words about the background. EPNoSL VIP is a series of programs including webinars and forum discussions on different topics related to school leadership. Forum discussions take place on the EPNoSL portal, where you will find the full program of the virtual platform as well. All activities are open to anyone interested, and if you also wish to contribute to the discussions, you need to register on the EPNoSL portal. Our topic today is Leading for Equality in a Changing Europe, and we are going to address this topic with the help of two speakers, Jacky Lumby and Downey from the UK, and the moderator of today's session is going to be Gerry from the University College Dublin. But before I hand over to Gerry, I'll just quickly guide you through the features of this webinar platform. So you will always see the person who is speaking. At the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a chat box, which you will be able to use to start discussion and ask your questions during the presentations already. You can also send private messages to each other by selecting Whisper from the drop-down menu which says Yes Now, and then selecting the participant you want to send the message to. At the bottom left-hand corner, you have a Give Feedback button, where you can give feedback during the presentation, and to reset it. So for example, I'll put it on applause now. And to put it back, you just have to select I am fine. This button will have a particular importance today because during the discussion you will have the possibility to speak as well. And if you would like to ask your question, please select the question button from this menu, the question icon. It will appear next to your name, and Gerry, the moderator, will activate your microphones, and so you can ask your questions. The webinar is going to be recorded, and the session will then be published on the EPNoSL portal. And one more important piece of information, your feedback is very important to us. So if you can dedicate a few moments after the webinar to give us feedback using the link that I will also post in the chat box, then we would be very grateful. And I will now hand over to Gerry, who will moderate the session.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's well. Nice to see you all here. This morning we have two speakers, as you probably are aware. We have Jacky Lumby and we have Chris. And Chris is going to start, Chris Downey from Southampton University. Chris's area is school improvement and effectiveness, and he is looking at education improvement and effectiveness, and especially in how effectiveness data can be utilised to inform and evaluate education improvement from the very beginning right up into higher education. So it's over to you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Good morning. If it is morning with you, or afternoon or evening, whatever time you're joining us, thanks very much for the introduction, Gerry. As Gerry mentioned, my presentation focuses on the use of school effectiveness research, which has been adopted quite substantially here, particularly in the English school system, to help school leaders and school teachers identify areas in which their effectiveness shows evidence of being differential, and by that we mean that perhaps the school is being more effective with some types of students and some groups of students than others, and to explore some of the issues that those measures then present. School effectiveness is a relatively young research field. It came very much as a response to suggestions that were made in the late 60s and early 1970s that it really doesn't matter what school you go to. There are a number of other characteristics which actually make much more difference to student outcomes than the school. And that this new research field was not without its critics. Early research showed that the schools did make a difference, but that difference was relatively modest and yet still statistically significant. And over time it's matured into a field which has tried to develop some theoretical perspectives around the early research evidence, and particularly to identify the characteristics of what makes for highly effective schools. My usual introduction when I'm thinking about school effectiveness measures that are used in schools is to ask people to think how we might determine the effectiveness of a high jump coaching program. So a different type of educational or instruction program, very different to what we might consider to be the usual day-to-day of school life. And I often do this with students on our postgraduate programs and get a whole range of suggestions coming back. And in many ways it depends what outcomes and aims you're actually trying to measure. And so it raises a few measurement issues for around effectiveness of a coaching program and equally effectiveness of schools. Whether you're measuring raw attainment, what we call raw attainment, rather than progress. In the high jump context, that would be, does it really matter? The only thing that matters is just how high you jump. So in say a world championship or Olympic perspective, we're really not interested in how much progress the jumpers make. We want to award the prize to those who jump the highest. And it might be great if you make fantastic progress, but really at the end of the day it's who jumps the highest that gets the gold. However, progress is very important, and if we're thinking about equity, there's a strong feeling within education, and rightly so, that it does matter what your baseline was that you started with, and therefore how much progress you make. The other thing that arises is whether you use what we call threshold measures or mean measures. And just to dig in a little bit deeper on those, threshold measures would be where you set a criterion, for example, the percentage of students which reach a particular outcome. And I'll illustrate that in a moment with the next slide. And the issue with threshold measures is not every student's outcome makes a contribution to the measure of the high jump program, or switching back to our focus, to schools. So only those who get over that particular criterion and go past it will actually contribute. There will always be a group of students who don't contribute to the measure for the school. Whereas with a straight mean measure, every student's outcome makes a contribution and therefore is included in the calculation which tells us about the effectiveness of the school. So moving on to a real example, and there should be a poll coming up towards the end of this slide which focuses on what have become quite infamous in the English school system, school league tables. These were developed some time ago, and we've had league tables of school performance for a long time in the English system, but not our current government, but the previous government placed even more importance on them through a policy context that was termed intelligent accountability. And I'll raise some question marks about that term a little later on. But the suggestion was, if we provide a large amount of data to schools in order for them to be self-evaluating, we also expect that data to be used in the public domain to make judgments about a school's performance and how effective that school is. And so you can see an example there on the slide of some English school league tables. This is actually taken from the BBC website, and you can see that there are two measures. If I just use the pointer, you can see a measure here, GCSE outcomes, and that's an example of what we call a threshold measure. So here, this is simply the percentage of young people who at age 16 reached a particular benchmark for outcomes in national tests. And you can see as you scan down the list that these schools are actually sorted in order of this threshold benchmark measure of school effectiveness or school performance. With a school up here at the top with 100% of its students reaching that benchmark, and a school down here at the bottom where I think it's only 20% reach that benchmark. Next to that is a different kind of measure, what we call CVA, which I'll talk about in more detail later on, called contextual value added. And this is a progress measure. So rather than the raw attainment, the outcome that students reach, this looks at progress, and so it factors in and adjusts for the prior attainment of students at, in this case, at age 11, when they started secondary or high school education. And it's also a mean measure, so that means every child in that school makes a contribution to the school's value here. Now, if you scan there, if you can see on the slide, you'll see that the CVA measure, if we were able to rank on that, would give you a different league table list of those schools than the GCSE raw attainment threshold measure. So you can see that built into the system here are two very different perspectives about how effective this small selection of schools are. And scanning down, it's a little small on my screen, but I think I'm right in saying that in terms of CVA, it's this school here, Chestnut Grove School, which has the highest CVA score, and that would place it at the top of the rankings for these schools, whereas by the threshold measure of GCSE outcomes, it's somewhere down in the bottom half. You'll also notice that a number of schools don't have a CVA measure, and that's because they're independent or private schools, and they did not conduct the tests at age 11, which give the prior attainment measure to help us calculate progress, and so they don't have a CVA score. Now you can see they tend to be up here on terms of the threshold measure, the older measure, in the top half of schools, and so already there's an issue in the system around being able to determine equity of outcome if we can't include private schools in a calculation which strives to be more a measure of equity. So I think it would be a time for the poll now, if it's possible to bring that up. And the question is, are there results on school outcomes published in your own local context? They might be different from the school league tables published here in England, and if so, in what form? And I put some options there for you to choose. Just thought it would be interesting out of all the participants to see if there are any public accountability measures of school outcomes published in your setting. So feel free to choose the response that matches your situation most closely. I'm hoping while you're doing that we can move on, so I'll go on to the next slide. I just wanted to use this slide to indicate that this discussion of school outcome measures is high stakes. Certainly for teachers, for students, and politically, and it raises the question about whether that policy agenda of intelligent accountability really is, whether the rhetoric has matched the intention. These over here, you'll see some examples of how this data in the public domain has been used to label schools, and these are all terms that have been used by politicians when they're discussing school effectiveness in the public domain. Our Minister of State for Education was reluctant to use the term failing schools, but the Prime Minister at the time wasn't so reticent. We also have the term coasting schools, which are those that seem to reach a particular position in terms of their academic outcomes and then seem to get stuck. And there's often discussion around using these measures in terms of naming and shaming schools, particularly as this stuff goes in the public domain, and the media, BBC, newspapers tend to focus on those who are in, say, the top 5% of schools, and especially those who are in the bottom 5 or 10%. So this can have significant effect on the reputation of schools, and considering that this information was put into the public domain originally to influence school choice on the part of parents, that's a massive issue. So the measures are often used within our inspection framework that many of you may be familiar with, carried out by the organisation Ofsted in order to determine pre-inspection judgments. So the same data can be used to develop what's called a pre-inspection hypothesis, and sometimes, not for general funding but for special projects, those outcomes can be used to determine whether schools have access to that funding. And you can imagine it creates a certain amount of competition between schools, particularly in a local context. And when we have many policy initiatives which encourage collaboration, you can see how this data can work against that. What I want to do now is move on to a few slides which indicate how these value-added measures ensure that every child's data makes a contribution. And what you can see here on the right-hand side are the outcomes, a plot of the outcomes of about 4,000 students who live in a particular region in England. And it's a graph. The horizontal axis here excuse me, plots their prior attainment at age 11, so the scores that they achieved in national tests at age 11. And on the vertical axis here you can see that there are the scores for their outcomes at age 16. So it's a plot of academic attainment on entry to the secondary education system, and when they reach the end of that here on the left. Now, as many of you will be aware, it's possible to run a statistical analysis that allows us to say, well, what's the pattern in this data, in these 4,000 data points? And many people would argue that this is an example of a reductionist approach, and it would be difficult to argue with that, because it's possible to produce a single best fit line which represents the trend in these 4,000 data points. And what that allows us to do is that the line represents the model, that's the best fit of the data here, and an individual student's outcome can therefore be calculated by knowing the model. That's the outcomes of the quiz. I'll just come to those in a moment. So knowing the outcomes here, the individual student's outcome can be measured against the model, the mean if you like, for these 4,000 students, and then what we call a residual, the difference between an individual student's outcome and the model or the mean that's represented by the line of best fit. And what that allows us to do, if the residual is positive, it's above the line, then we can say this student's outcome is above the average for this group. Whereas if the outcome was below the line, then we could say the outcome is below average. And that gives us an opportunity to talk about value-added outcomes and whether a student's result is significantly above or below the mean. Just popping back to the results, it's interesting to see, I'm not sure everybody voted, but we've got league tables and results of school inspections looking like they're some of the most common, and yet there's a similar number there saying that there are no published data on school outcomes. So some of you will be aware of this public accountability perspective. Just moving on, school effectiveness research in its early days recognised that students aren't islands isolated from one another. They live on other islands, if you like, called schools. And so schools have a clustering effect, that students are grouped together as members of a particular school. And this was quite a significant way of modelling the data, because it allowed us to determine what the size of the school effect on the student's outcome was. And we model that using something called multi-level modelling or hierarchical modelling. And it allows us, instead of having a single line to represent all 4,000 students, it allows us to plot school lines. So you can see here on the left there are a number of lines, 20 in fact in this region, and those represent the mean line for the students clustered within an individual school. And so we have a new set of residuals, the distance between the overall mean, which is the black line still there in the background, and the position of the line for the school. So this residual here is the residual for the highest performing school in this data set, the one at the top there, which is well above the average. And this residual is the school residual for the lowest performing school. And for an individual student, it's possible to calculate their boost, if you like, or difference between the overall mean by breaking it down into the school effect, the portion that the school adds, and then the residual which is due to the student. And it's these school residuals that allow us to calculate the value-added school performance measures. And here's a plot of the school residuals there, the school effectiveness measure for these 20 schools, and we've added confidence intervals so we can say whether these values are significantly different from one another. The dotted line across the middle there represents the mean for this group, and so you can see there are 3 schools, because their confidence interval doesn't cross that line, that have significantly below average value-added scores. And there are just 2 schools whose confidence interval doesn't cross this mean line that have value-added scores significantly above average. The remainder, so that's 15 schools, have a confidence interval which cuts this line, and therefore it's not possible for us to say that these are significantly different from the average for this set of schools. This is just a small number of schools drawn from the national set, just to keep things a little bit clearer. There are 3,000 secondary schools in the national data set where this is calculated, so there would be a lot more schools above, significantly above and below the national average. But one of the issues with using even a measure like this, which tries to factor in progress and also make sure that every child's data makes a contribution to the measure of the effectiveness of the school, is that it implies that one number can therefore describe the effectiveness of the school. It makes no distinction as to whether the school gives the same lift to all its students, and of course that will never be the case. There won't be a school that gives the same amount of lift or value added to each of the children that study there. And so that, in a sense, what the value added number does is tells you what lift the school will give to the educational outcomes of the average child. And whenever I discuss this, I normally say, well, I've yet to meet a parent who claims to have an average child. I myself have 3 children, and I'd like to think that none of them are average. They're all special to me as their father, and so no parent claims to have an average child. And so therefore, if this measure really says what the school does for the average child, I'd be more interested to know what the school can do for my child. What it also tells us, this kind of analysis, is that between 5 to 18%, and this is based on international studies, of the variation in students' academic outcomes is located at the school level. So the school does make a significant difference, but that difference is around 5 to 18% in terms of its power to explain the variance in student outcomes. So there's a vast proportion that's still locked up at a level lower than the school, at least. And one of the things that we don't have time to discuss today is the missing level that could run across the middle here of the class. And that, if measuring school effects is controversial, that could be even more controversial, because particularly in primary education the class is often associated with a single teacher. So would we be looking at a measure of teacher effectiveness, and what would happen if those sorts of measures went into the public domain in the way that school measures have? Just to illustrate how we can look at some of the differences for different groups of children, it is possible to model the data differently and so show that across the spread of prior attainment, some children get more of a lift than others. Here's that highest performing school in this group, and you can see that for children here down at the low end of prior attainment, who came in at age 11 with the lower national test scores, the school gives more of a lift above the average for this set of schools than it does for students who come in with higher prior attainment. You could argue, and you can see this kind of a grouping effect up here at the top, that for this group of schools, if your child had high prior attainment, some of the highest in this area, it may not make much of a difference which of the 20 schools in this area your child went to. They're likely to get a similar lift from what being in that school would mean for them. But for a child down at the lower end of prior attainment, it may well make a difference which of those 20 schools your child happened to go to, if you were able to exercise choice. And just to illustrate that, here's a line for another school which shows an example of what we call the highest differential effectiveness. For children at the high prior attainment end, it's as good as the average for this set, but for children down at the low prior attainment end, it's one of the lowest in terms of the effectiveness of the school. And of course this is only based on 1 year's worth of data, and that's not to suggest that this school would have a similar issue with children of low prior attainment year on year. It's just 1 year's worth of evidence. Now this sort of data is beginning to go into the public domain, but has been available to schools for some time, and I've just got a couple of slides to finish now which show the attempt from the government to live up to this aim of intelligent accountability, to say, as well as placing all this data in the public domain, let's put it into the hands of school leaders and teachers to inform school improvement. And so schools for some time have been able to break down their outcomes across the different groups of students, so to compare males and females. So you can see here that females are getting higher outcomes than males, significantly higher than the national average, whereas males in this school are also significantly higher but performing less well than females. You can also break that down into groups of prior attainment. These are based on the levels that the students reached at age 11 before they entered secondary school, similarly for males. And then over here, importantly, measures of socio-economic status. The free school meal entitlement, which is what FSM stands for here, is a contested measure of socio-economic status, but it's widely used in the UK system when looking at school effectiveness. And so you can see in this school that children eligible to free school meals make better progress than their non-free school meal counterparts, but when you look at the confidence interval, that difference is not statistically significant. However, both groups make significantly higher progress than the national average. And so the government makes all this data available in some very sophisticated data sets which are available to every teacher in the school, although not all schools make it possible for all their teachers to see it, but school leaders normally do. And inspectors, the quid pro quo is that school inspectors get to see this data as well and hold schools to account for the progress of groups of students like this. And I think I'll just finish with these two slides, which you can look at more at your leisure, but this is an example of an output from one of these national databases, Raise Online, provided by the Department for Education and the School Inspection Service, Ofsted. Here's some demographic data around eligibility to free school meals, which places the school and shows that this particular school here is a very high proportion of students eligible to free school meals, so it's likely to be in a deprived area. And this measures on a range of threshold and attainment and progress measures the outcomes for the school, and so provides some key data for a school in order to judge its effectiveness with different groups of students and consider questions around its equity of provision. So I think I'll finish there and hand back over to Gerry.
Hi Chris, thank you very much for that. Okay, very good. We're just trying at the moment to get Jacky, if that's okay. We've had trouble linking into Jacky, so you might just stay with us and we might just have some questions, please, from the group. Can I ask you a question, Chris? Well, we're just one very brief question. To what extent? To what extent is the size of? Hold on a second. We've got a couple here. Well, I was going to ask you, to what extent are teachers aware of this data? How does it impact their practice? Are they?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Jacky. Good stuff. We got you. Okay.
Okay, terrific. Whew, what a relief.
That question, Chris.
Yes, yeah, I can answer that. We've done some research, some colleagues and I, which suggests that school leaders are very, very aware of this data, down to quite a degree of detail. Classroom teachers who don't have leadership responsibilities are less aware.
Okay.
They normally would consider the data for their own class, but not necessarily have access to the school-wide data, which we think is a shame, because the opportunity to see how a student is doing within different subject areas could be quite powerful.
Yeah, okay, very interesting. Yeah, it's usually their own class. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. And I'll try and pick up some of the questions in the chat as we go on. Okay.
Can you see the questions in the chat?
Yeah, I'll respond to those. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hi Jacky.
Bye.
How are you? Thank you.
Hello, I'm fine, thank you. I'm hoping
Okay,
you can hear me okay.
Okay, we can hear you okay. That's perfect. Okay, this is Professor Jacky Lumby, also from Southampton, and many of you already know Jacky as part of the network. And as we know, her main interests are on the issues of equality, equity, diversity, gender and power. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jacky, and I'm so glad you're here. Okay.
I'm very glad to be here too. As you've gathered, I've had a few technical hitches, but they're hopefully solved and you can hear my voice and see the slides. The presentation I'm giving today is about leading for equality in a changing Europe. It's not going to be an academic discussion about the definition of equality or inclusion or any of the other terms that are related, but rather focusing on leader practice in this changed Europe. Now, what do I mean by changed Europe? Gerry, next slide, please. You can see here a picture of children in Europe essentially living in squalor. And my argument is that more and more children in Europe are actually coming to school while living in these kinds of conditions. There are widening differentials in national economic performance between Europe and the rest of the world, some parts of which are outstripping us. Youth unemployment is reaching staggering levels in some parts of Europe. Migration, that is, children who themselves or whose parents were born outside Europe, is over 10% in Germany, Belgium, Austria, France, and so on, and over 20% in Switzerland and Luxembourg. You can see from the graph, next slide please, Gerry, that even in the wealthiest parts of Europe, 1 in 10 children are living in poverty, and in the least wealthy parts of Europe, something like 1 in 4. Of course, this won't be evenly spread throughout schools, and some schools will have concentrations of children living in poverty. The point I'm trying to make is that the proportion of children likely to be perceived as somehow different, problematic, in deficit, is much higher than previously, and that this creates a context in which leading for equality is a different kind of task to what it's been before. Next slide, please, Gerry. This is reflected in young people's attitude to education. The United Nations held an e-conversation, and you can see from the slide that a lot of young people contributed. Children and young people are, in many cases, losing confidence in education, both the quality of the education they receive and what it's actually for. Education has never led to a secure economic future for some children, but increasingly that number is much larger. So children are questioning, what is my education for? Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Gerry. Next slide, please, Gerry. I'm arguing that previously leaders have, in many cases, argued that the causes of inequality are external to schools, that children had issues with their language of instruction because they aren't read to by their families, because they're impoverished, because they don't have a learning culture. Many, many reasons why children are not learning. But the argument that Gerry McCrock makes very tellingly in his keynote, and that I'm making today, is that striving for inclusion and inclusive schooling needs a very particular set of values from leaders and a sense of what is needed. And for me, the most important point is the last sentence in this slide. It cannot be assumed that this value base is a naturally occurring attribute of all leaders. We cannot assume that all leaders have a vision for equality or that they will act in ways that will embed it. Next slide, please. On the contrary, I'm arguing that schools are spaces where inequality is sustained, and we have known this for a long time, long-standing, very secure research knowledge, and I'm just going to pick out one or two examples of what I mean. Schools are often structured to suit teachers and teaching, not learners. For example, tracking, where children are organized into groups by ability. It makes teaching considerably easier in many cases, but there is evidence that it does not help learning, particularly of those who are most disadvantaged. On the contrary, they are likely to be given a less challenging curriculum, and leaders, in many cases, allocate the least experienced teachers to such groups that are perceived as having less ability, so they're doubly disadvantaged. The second example is that teachers stereotype students. They don't mean to do this, but they do. Again, there is considerable evidence of this, and this makes a difference to how much attention each student is given and assessment of their work, both in terms of their potential and their actual performance. I said that people are generally not aware of this, and you can see in the final point on this slide that every single day leaders and teachers give countless messages to students about how they are assessed in terms of their worth, not by what they necessarily say or do, but by their body language, by their tone of voice, even by the amount of eye contact that they have with the student. And students are very acute at picking up what people think about them and the demotivation that follows from assessments that are stereotyped and less than perhaps that student or child deserves. Now, I'm interested to know what your view on this is, so we're going to pause at this point for a voting exercise. You will see from the voting options that are about to be put up, hopefully. Have we got the voting exercise ready? Yeah. I'm going to ask you to press the button next to the statement that is most accurate in relation either to your own school, if you work in a school, or to schools in your area, if you work with a number of schools. The statements range from all children are given appropriate attention and chances through to the practice of schools is not appropriate for most children, with two gradations in between that you can see. We've lost the end of the second one, which reads, schools provide good learning opportunities for most children, but fail a few. The third is the practice of schools excludes many children. And the final one, the practice of schools is not appropriate for most children. Could you please vote now? And we'll wait to see what the result is and what your view is about how your school is doing in terms of equity. Okay, let's hope the result can be put up now, if people could finish voting. And let's see if we've got the result. Well, interestingly, none of you believe that all children are given appropriate attention and chances. So the belief of this group of participants is that schools are failing at least some children. Interestingly, the votes are spread amongst the other ones, and at least 4 voters believe that the practice of schools is not appropriate for most children. So all of you agree that schools are not providing good learning opportunities for most or many children. Thank you. We can close that now and go on to the next slide. You can see a photograph of a classroom here. It's a well-resourced classroom. The children look well-nourished. They look well-dressed. It's certainly not a group of children that look as if they are coming from a disadvantaged background. My question to you is, how would you assess this class in as far as you can from just looking at a photograph? Is this class a success or a failure? Well, my view would be it's a failure. At least one child, the boy at the centre at the back row who's slumped forward, seems to me to not learn. He's not learning in this class. And it seems to me the indications are that maybe other children in that room are also not learning. Now, somebody visiting that classroom might feel that the teaching that was taking place was fine. The children obviously are looking at good resources, they're quiet, they're looking forward, there's no misbehavior. But for me, the class is a failure because not all the children in that group are learning. Next slide, please. So what can leaders do in order to increase equality in the school? Well, the first thing I'm asking, you may say, well, this is so obvious. Don't leaders speak with integrity all the time to learners, staff and school? Well, I would argue that they don't. It's not that they mean to speak without integrity, but too often the discourse that is given to children, their families and teachers by leaders is essentially dishonest. It's about how if you work hard at education and gain qualifications, that will lead to a bright future. And it's a kind of myth that is sold to the school community. In the changing Europe that I've painted, I don't think that kind of dishonesty is any longer tenable. And I think leaders need to find new ways of talking to the school community about what school is for, what it can achieve, how it can achieve that, how children can be equipped both to take part in society as far as is possible and also to challenge society. A different kind of conversation is needed. The second point on this slide, again, appears to be obvious, but I don't think is obvious at all. And that's leaders insisting all children can learn. All children can learn. Teachers will protest that this is what they believe, but actually there's considerable evidence that they don't believe this. And I'm going to refer later briefly to some evidence from my own research. Many see some children as essentially unable to learn because of a host of reasons that I referred to earlier. And although they may continue to provide them with tasks and so on, in their heart they have decided those children are not going to progress in an acceptable way. And the final point, in order to do something about these things, leaders need to focus relentlessly on developing pedagogy. If you are to make any impact on the kind of unconscious signals that an earlier slide referred to, which on a daily basis give messages of worth and the opposite to children and young people in schools, then the odd workshop, the odd session in preparation programs for leaders really are not going to make an impact. Changing the pedagogy so that the class on the right in this slide would be seen by everybody as a failure will take years rather than hours, and that persistent, determined fight to make sure all children needs are met through the pedagogy that's presented. As evidence for what I've been suggesting, I'm drawing on a study of high school education in England. This spoke to a very large number of leaders, teachers, governors, parents and children in high schools throughout England. A subgroup was young people perceived as disaffected by their school. That is, either they were not coming to the school very much anymore, they were truanting, or they did come, but when they came, they didn't actually try with learning any longer or misbehaved and disrupted everything. The views of these children are in these key points. Firstly, They didn't feel incompetent or unable to learn. On the contrary, but they thought their schooling itself was not fit for purpose. They were clear about what conditions helped them learn. They wanted experiential learning, to work as a team with others. They needed very clear instructions, and so on. But they didn't experience these conditions very often. Too often, what they actually received was didactic teaching in which they simply got lost. A key factor was a sense of a positive relation with adults who thought they were competent. These children, on the whole, did not have such positive relations with adults. And they felt that teachers and leaders often had a rhetoric, although they didn't use that word, that's what they were saying, a rhetoric of meeting all the needs of all their students by asking pupils to fit into the mainstream and not changing the mainstream to fit needs. It was a rather depressing picture. So, I repeat the points that I've made, that leaders need to do some things that are at one level obvious, but at another level extremely difficult. To do all of the three things on this slide takes enormous moral courage, persistence, and determination. Teachers, there is evidence to show, push back against changes to include all learners. They prefer arrangements which make it easier for them to teach their subject, arrangements which don't exhaust them because they're having to deal with a wider range of needs and work with a wider range of methods. Families of advantaged children also sometimes object to change because the system as is privileges their children. So there will be potentially a lot of resistance. But to make any kind of impact on at least eroding the inequality which currently exists, then leaders need to have a new kind of conversation, a more honest conversation with the school community. They need to believe and to constantly insist that all children can learn, and to do this they need a long-term project to adjust pedagogy. I'm sure you'll have many points and questions yourself, but I've put up a few discussion points just to add to the discussion between us all that follows. What kind of future might leaders offer as a vision for children, particularly in those parts of Europe where things are looking very grim economically for children in the future? How might leaders help staff become more aware of the unconscious ways they enact inequality? And how might pedagogy be developed to be inclusive as a long-term project? Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion. I hand back to Gerry.
Thank you very much, Jacky. That's great. Thank you very much. Hi there, everybody. That's brilliant. I'm glad we got that. We got that presentation. Okay. Now we have just 10 minutes left for questions or discussions or comments. There are a number of comments coming up there in the chat, but can we just, if you want to ask a question, and if you want to ask it so that your mic is turned on, if you just press the question button. There's Anna from Portugal. You can read through there. Maybe can you, I'm not 100% sure, Jacky, if you can actually see the I think you can.
Yes, I can see the comments. I can see, okay, and I can respond if you when you wish me to. Right, Gerry makes a point, if we do not know what is equality, it's impossible to lead to increase equality. I absolutely agree. That is a really fundamental point. I didn't want to spend a lot of time today on the academic discussion of the nature of equality. It is very contested, but I do think each school needs to have that discussion. What do they mean by equality? What would it look like? How would you know when you achieved it? So that people within the school are clear, though many schools will of course reach a different conclusion about what equality is. But I agree it's important to understand it. I just set it aside for today. The point equity and equality, of course, follows on from that. There are many, many, many papers discussing the nature of equity, equality, inclusion, diversity, etc. I think it's important to discuss them and to get some clarity in each school, but not to be diverted into the joy of definition rather than actually thinking about the practice, which in the end is what is most important, I think. So good point from Gerry, and I agree.
And Anna is saying there that it demands ethics and political change, which is very true. Do you see that there?
I absolutely agree, yes, I agree. Yes, Chris's point that defining equality as key in discussion within a school can be a profound experience in itself. I'd be interested, it's a pity we don't have a voting exercise at this point, but I wonder how many of the schools of participants have actually had a discussion about how they understand equality and come to a conclusion about that. Often when in my research I go into schools and ask them, people are rather surprised and they haven't had that kind of discussion. I think it would be very useful to have it. I agree with Chris and Gerry and with Anna Paula.
Okay. Chris.
Yeah, I've just put my webcam and microphone back on as Nóra suggested.
Some of the comments that were coming through, Chris, during Jacky's presentation, is there anything there that you want to talk a little bit more about?
I think the two, in a sense, show you the balanced approach, which is tremendously challenging, which is required in any educational institution to try and determine whether there may be an issue for equality and equity. From my perspective, as I hope I've tried to suggest in the presentation and in the responses, the data can only take you so far. The powerful thing about the data is even if it matches with what you already know as a school leader, for example, that in itself is a powerful thing. It then gives more evidence base, more power to your elbow, if you like, to take action. But it cannot be used on its own. It needs skill to interpret the data, and certainly needs to be put alongside other sources of evidence. And there was an interesting discussion there, picking up on what Philip said, that although the school effect is modest, as Jacky was suggesting, it can be profound for individual students. And the trouble with effectiveness measures is that's the mean effect for the average child. But Jacky was picking up on students who are not the average. They're the much more vulnerable, much more likely to be disaffected, and there the more fine-grained analysis is crucial to find out who these students are, how much they're being affected, and what we might need to do about it.
Okay, yeah. Very true, yeah.
If I could make the point, I think what leaders are aiming at is a kind of attitude change, where we see mainstream centre students and a periphery of somehow students who are in deficit. And Gerry makes this paper very powerfully in his keynote paper. If we could change attitudes so that we don't see mainstream and problematic, but just all children with different needs, how profound a change that would be. But I agree with Anna Paula that this would be a big ethical and political change for people, and not one to be achieved quickly or easily, and essentially one that leaders need to try to effect, because it needs that kind of moral leadership.
Okay, Philip is making a point there.
I think too, picking up on that, there also it requires national leadership as well, and certainly in the UK the emphasis has been on using the accountability mechanisms to force schools to put the spotlight on different groups of students, particularly those who might be disadvantaged, and as Gerry is pointing out, not just those who are low performing but high performing students as well, who might be held back. But the balance has been much more on punitive measures, I think, rather than supporting schools to do what they need to do to help those students get the progress that they require.
Mm-hmm.
I think Phil Wood's point about a particular approach to social justice, looking at different elements of it, is helpful. I think the first step is to agree as a community what the aim is, what equality and equity might look like, and then to develop a more detailed agenda for how adjustments might take place, so that all students feel the school is designed for them, not designed for a group, with adjustments at the edge. And those 4 approaches that Phil suggested, I think, could be very helpful for that.
Yeah, social justice. One of the things that I think is an issue is that many of the equality measures are policies that are derived from the notion of equality actually can have very inequitable outcomes. And I refer to a recent policy in Ireland which was to introduce free third-level fees for everybody, with the result that the middle classes benefited much more from that policy decision than the groups who were typically excluded from higher education. It was equal, everybody was treated the same, but it had inequitable outcomes, and that's why I think the clarity between equity and equality needs to be a little bit more established.
Yes, if I could make a point that by equality I certainly don't mean treating everybody the same. That was the 1950s European approach of literally treating everybody the same. It didn't last very long, and it certainly isn't what is meant by equality in my view. But we could spend another webinar very happily talking about what is implied by equality, equity, inclusion, and so on.
I think we still have a very old-fashioned view of equality here. It's the 1950s.
Right.
Everybody has to get it, otherwise it's politically difficult.
Yeah.
Are there any other...
I think
Go on, sorry.
I was going to say Phil's point about designing the school for the people, not the other way round, is a very good encapsulation of what we've been talking about.
Yeah. I wonder to what extent, Chris, you might have a view on this. Is the focus on outcomes and that kind of heavy-duty effectiveness sort of shaping schools in a very particular way?
Yeah, there's no question. That old adage, you end up valuing what you measure, and particularly in such a high-stakes environment as we have in the UK, that schools are forced to respond to what the academic outcome data says on a day-to-day basis, and that a lot of effort will be invested in trying to maximise those outcomes, because they're clearly the ones that are very much in the spotlight in the public domain. And our feeling is that hence the need to ensure that even if that's not the most satisfactory route to determining effectiveness, the measures we choose need to be those which at very least try to incorporate the progress of every student, and not just those threshold measures which just capture the outcomes for some.
Yeah, that's interesting. That can shape things differently.
Indeed, yeah.
Are there any other comments or questions? We're coming up to 11. I think we're on 11. Are we done there then? Okay, we've got silence on the text, we've got silence on the screen. Can I just take this opportunity to thank Chris and Jacky for both their presentations. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm not 100% sure that Nóra has just put a text up there just to please, at the end of this, if you don't mind, if you just log on to the SurveyMonkey and then you can just give your views in relation to the presentations. Do you want to say something there, Nóra? Thanks again, Jacky. Thanks again, Chris. Nóra, it's over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jacky, Gerry and Chris, for the presentations and the very lively discussion. Just one thing, the webinar will be uploaded on the portal at the end of this week, and next week the last forum discussion starts with Gerry's keynote article. So please join the forum discussion on the portal. and we would be happy if you gave us feedback. And thank you very much for being here. Bye.
Bye-bye, Nóra. Bye, everybody. Thank you very much.